"Don't you dare touch that piano." The words hit Isabella Martinez like a slap across the face as she stood frozen, her cleaning cloth trembling in her hand, staring at the pristine white keys that seemed to call out to her very soul. Before we continue, if you enjoy incredible true stories of triumph against all odds, make sure to click that subscribe button. This is the best way for you to support our work. Thank you very much, and let's continue. Isabella had heard those exact words every single night for the past 6 months as she cleaned the prestigious Harmony Conservatory of Music. Every night, as she mopped the floors of the grand concert hall, her eyes would drift to the magnificent Steinway grand piano that sat center stage like a sleeping giant. And every night, the security guard would remind her of the strict rule that no one except students and faculty was allowed to touch the instruments. But tonight was different. Tonight, something inside Isabella's chest was breaking apart, and she couldn't understand why the sight of those keys made her heart race with a longing so intense it physically hurt. Isabella Martinez was 32 years old, a single mother of 2, working 3 jobs just to survive. By day, she cleaned offices downtown, starting at 6 a.m. and finishing at noon. By evening, she waited tables at a small diner called Rose's, serving coffee and dreams to customers who treated her like she was invisible. And by night, from 11 p.m. to 6 a.m., she cleaned the hallowed halls of one of the most prestigious music schools in the country. Her dark hair was always pulled back in a neat ponytail, her uniform pristine despite the exhaustion that lived permanently behind her warm brown eyes. She was beautiful in a way that struggle makes a person beautiful, with high cheekbones and graceful movements that spoke of hidden depths. The father of her children had left when Diego was 6 and Sofia was 4, disappearing one morning with promises to send money that never came. Isabella had been working as a cashier at a grocery store then, barely making ends meet with one job. When he left, taking their small savings account with him, Isabella's world collapsed. She was forced to find additional work, any work that would fit around her children's schedules. The conservatory was a world she could never belong to, where wealthy families sent their talented children to refine gifts Isabella could only dream of possessing. Students arrived in expensive cars driven by nannies, carrying instrument cases that cost more than Isabella's monthly rent. She had grown up in foster care, bouncing from home to home after her teenage mother died in a car accident when Isabella was 7. She never stayed anywhere long enough to take music lessons or join school programs, too busy helping younger foster children adapt to new homes and new rules. Her children, Sofia and Diego, 8 and 10 years old, were everything to her. Sofia had inherited her mother's artistic soul, always humming made-up songs and drawing elaborate pictures with whatever supplies Isabella could afford from the dollar store. Diego was serious beyond his years, often helping his sister with homework while Isabella worked her night shift, making sure doors were locked and that Sofia took her vitamins. They lived in a small 2-bedroom apartment in a neighborhood where sirens were a nightly lullaby and dreams seemed like luxuries they couldn't afford. Every morning when Isabella came home exhausted, smelling of cleaning chemicals and carrying the weight of another sleepless night, Sofia would ask the same question with the persistence only children possess. "Mama, did you see anything beautiful today?" Isabella would tell her about the oil paintings in ornate frames, the soaring architecture with its carved details, the way morning light streamed through stained glass windows and painted rainbows on marble floors. But she never mentioned the piano, never spoke of how it called to something deep inside her that she didn't understand. 3 months into her job, Isabella first heard Professor Elena Vasquez practice late one evening. She had been in the administrative wing, emptying waste baskets and wiping down surfaces, when the most beautiful sound she had ever heard began floating through the building like a gentle current. It was Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, though Isabella didn't know its name then. She only knew that the music made her chest tight and her eyes water, as if something inside her was recognizing a language she had forgotten she spoke, a mother tongue she never knew she possessed. She crept toward the sound like a moth drawn to flame, abandoning her cleaning cart in the middle of the hallway. Through the partially open door of the concert hall, she watched Professor Vasquez's fingers dance across the keys with impossible elegance. The professor was in her early 40s, with silver-streaked dark hair worn in an elegant chignon, her posture regal even in solitude. She was a former concert pianist who had performed with major orchestras across Europe and America before dedicating herself to teaching. Students spoke of her in hushed, reverent tones, both feared and adored for her exacting standards and transformative instruction. Professor Vasquez's entire body moved with the music, swaying slightly as if the piano were an extension of her soul. Her eyes closed in concentration that bordered on meditation. Isabella watched, transfixed, as the woman seemed to disappear entirely into the sound she was creating, becoming one with the instrument in a way that seemed almost spiritual. For 30 minutes, Isabella stood hidden in the shadows, watching as Professor Vasquez worked through the nocturne, occasionally stopping to replay difficult passages, her brow furrowed in concentration as she worked out fingerings and phrasing. Even in these moments of technical work, there was something magical about her connection to the music, as if she were having a conversation with the composer himself. That night, something awakened in Isabella that she couldn't name or understand. It was as if a door had been opened in her mind to a room she never knew existed, filled with possibilities she had never dared to imagine. Professor Vasquez unknowingly became her teacher, staying late several nights a week to practice for upcoming performances. Isabella learned to time her cleaning schedule around these impromptu concerts, positioning herself where she could watch and listen without being detected. She studied how the professor's hands moved, how her foot worked the pedals, developing an intuitive understanding of how melodies and harmonies fit together. One night, Isabella found a discarded book behind a desk in the music library, Basic Piano for Adult Beginners. The cover was worn and the pages yellowed, clearly abandoned by some student who had moved on to more advanced materials. Isabella looked around to make sure she was alone, then opened it with trembling fingers, as if she were about to handle something sacred. The book started with the absolute basics, treating the reader like someone who had never seen a piano before. It explained the layout of the keyboard, showed where middle C was located with helpful diagrams, and introduced fundamental concepts like scales, intervals, and simple chords. Isabella spent her entire 15-minute break that night reading, absorbing information like a desert plant soaks up the first rain in months. The diagrams showing proper hand position fascinated her. The gentle curve of the fingers, the relaxed shoulders, the way the wrist should float naturally above the keys. The explanations of rhythm and timing opened up a mathematical world she had never known existed, where music followed patterns and rules that made logical sense. There were sections on dynamics, explaining how forte and pianissimo could transform the emotional impact of the same notes, and chapters on pedaling that made her understand why Professor Vasquez's foot moved in such specific ways. The book became her secret companion, her passport to a world she was forbidden to enter. She began carrying it with her everywhere, hidden beneath the cleaning supplies in her cart, wrapped in a plastic bag to protect it from the chemicals she used. During quiet moments when she was sure no one would see, she would pull it out and study a few pages, memorizing the information like her life depended on it. She practiced finger exercises in the air while walking between buildings, moving her hands as if she were playing an invisible piano. She memorized the layout of the keyboard so thoroughly that she could close her eyes and visualize exactly where every note was located. During her lunch breaks at the diner, she would sketch keyboard layouts on napkins, practicing writing out scales and simple chord progressions, her coworkers assuming she was taking some kind of correspondence course. The book had exercises for developing finger independence, and Isabella would practice these silently while serving customers, pressing each finger down on the table as if it were a key, building the muscle memory that the book insisted was crucial for proper technique. She learned about musical notation, deciphering the mysterious symbols that had always looked like a foreign language to her. Slowly, painfully, she began to understand the relationship between the dots and lines on the page and the sounds they represented. But reading about music and playing were different things entirely, and Isabella knew touching the instruments meant immediate termination. The security guard had made it clear these pianos were worth more than most people's annual salaries. The breaking point came on a Thursday night in December. Diego had come home with a black eye from fighting boys who mocked his second-hand clothes. Sophia's persistent cough kept her awake, and Isabella couldn't afford a proper doctor visit. The electric bill arrived with a final notice, She was $50 short despite working 3 jobs. That afternoon, Isabella had dropped dishes at the diner, earning a gentle but firm warning from her manager. Walking to the conservatory through bitter cold, she felt crushed by the weight of her struggles. At 3 a.m., she reached the concert hall. The grand piano sat center stage, illuminated by a single work light. As she cleaned, the familiar longing rose stronger than ever, mixed with desperation that made her hands shake. She moved closer to the instrument, drawn by an inexplicable force. Climbing the stage steps, her heart pounded. She sat on the bench, adjusting it as she'd seen Professor Vasquez do countless times. With trembling hands, she positioned her fingers over the keys, following instructions from her hidden book. And then, with courage she didn't know she possessed, Isabella pressed middle C. The sound was pure and clear, resonating through the empty hall like a prayer. Just one note, but to Isabella, it was the most beautiful thing she'd ever heard. The vibration traveled through the bench into her body, like coming home. She pressed another key, then another, playing a simple scale. Her fingering was awkward, timing uncertain, but the sounds bypassed her brain and spoke directly to her soul. Isabella lost track of time, exploring the keyboard, creating intuitive melodies that sounded right to her ear. She was so absorbed she didn't hear footsteps approaching. Professor Vasquez had returned for forgotten sheet music when she heard someone playing the nocturne she'd worked on earlier. But this wasn't a student. The playing was tentative yet filled with raw emotional honesty that made her breath catch. She found Isabella at the piano, eyes closed, face serene, transformed from tired cleaning woman into something luminous. Professor Vasquez recognized immediately that she was witnessing something extraordinary, natural musicality that couldn't be learned from books. When Isabella finished and opened her eyes, she startled to find Professor Vasquez watching with wonder. "Please don't stop," Professor Vasquez said softly. "That was beautiful." Isabella immediately stood, face flushing with fear. "I'm so sorry, Professor. I know I'm not supposed to touch the piano. Please don't report me. I need this job. My children depend on me." "Stop," Professor Vasquez said gently. "What's your name?"
Isabella Martinez, Mom.
"I've been cleaning here for 6 months. How long have you been playing piano?" Isabella's eyes filled with tears. "I don't play piano, ma'am. I can't even read music properly. I just found a discarded book and watched you practice. I know I was wrong, but your music makes me feel like I can breathe." "You've never had lessons?" "No, ma'am. I can't afford lessons. Music lessons are for people with money, people who belong in places like this." Professor Vasquez stared in amazement. This woman with no training had just played Chopin with emotional depth many advanced students never achieved. "Play something else," she whispered. Isabella sat back down, playing something softer, entirely her own. A musical expression of every struggle, every joy despite hardships, every dream for her children. When the last notes faded, tears streamed down her face. "What was that piece?" Professor Vasquez asked, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't know. I just played what I felt." Professor Vasquez studied Isabella intently. "What I just witnessed shouldn't be possible. You played Chopin with understanding that takes years to develop. That improvisation was extraordinary. I want to help you," she said suddenly. "This talent is remarkable. Would you be interested in lessons?" Isabella's heart leaped, but reality crashed down. "I can't afford lessons, Professor. What if I taught you for free?" The offer hung between them, too wonderful to believe. "I couldn't ask you to do that." "You're not asking. I'm offering. I've been teaching 15 years and never encountered raw talent like yours." They arranged lessons, 6:30 a.m., twice weekly, before classes started. Isabella could finish cleaning and return for instruction. The lessons began the following week, and they were unlike anything Isabella could have imagined. Professor Vasquez was a demanding but patient teacher, pushing Isabella to correct her self-taught habits while nurturing the natural musicality that made her playing so compelling. They started with fundamentals that most people learned as children: posture, breathing, how to sit at the bench so that her body could move naturally with the music. "Your hands tell a story," Professor Vasquez explained during their third lesson, watching as Isabella worked through a simple Bach invention. "But right now, it's like you're trying to tell that story with a broken pen. We need to give you the proper tools so your voice can be heard clearly." Isabella's progress was remarkable, but it came at a tremendous cost. The early morning lessons, combined with her regular work schedule, meant she was getting less than 4 hours of sleep most nights. She survived on coffee and sheer determination, her body running on the adrenaline that came from finally doing something that fed her soul. Her performance at her other jobs began to suffer as she struggled to stay alert during long shifts, but every musical breakthrough made the sacrifice feel worthwhile. Professor Vasquez found herself staying later and later to accommodate their lessons, arriving at the conservatory before dawn to work with Isabella in the quiet hours before the building came alive with regular students. She was more invested in Isabella's progress than she had been in any student's development in years. There was something pure about Isabella's approach to music, uncontaminated by the competitive pressures and technical obsessions that often plagued formally trained musicians. "You play like someone who has lived," Professor Vasquez told her one morning after Isabella had worked through a particularly emotional interpretation of a Schumann piece. "Most of my students play like they're trying to impress someone. You play like you're trying to heal someone." Isabella practiced obsessively, not just during their formal lessons but every moment she could steal from her exhausting schedule. She would run through fingerings while washing dishes at the diner, her hands moving silently through the motions while her mind heard the music. She visualized chord progressions while mopping office floors, and worked through musical phrases in her head during the long bus rides between jobs. Music had become as essential to her as breathing, and she couldn't imagine going back to the gray, colorless existence she had lived before. Her children began to notice the profound change in their mother. Despite her exhaustion, there was a new light in Isabella's eyes, a sense of purpose that had been missing for most of their lives. Sophia started asking more questions about music, and Isabella found herself sharing small pieces of what she was learning, explaining in simple terms how melodies worked and why certain combinations of notes sounded sad or happy or mysterious. "Mama," Sophia said one evening as Isabella helped her with homework, her small voice filled with wonder, "when you talk about music, you look different. You look like you're glowing from the inside." Diego, ever protective of his mother and suspicious of anything that might take her attention away from their precarious family situation, had initially been wary of this new passion that was consuming even more of her limited time and energy. But when he saw how the lessons seemed to ease some of the weight that his mother had carried for so long, how she hummed softly while cooking dinner for the first time in years, he began to understand that this wasn't just another burden she was taking on. It was something that was actually healing her. 2 months later, Professor Vasquez made an announcement that changed everything. The conservatory hosts an annual scholarship competition next month. It's open to all ages and backgrounds. The winner receives a full scholarship to study here. Isabella's hands stilled. "Professor, I couldn't compete with real students. You have something most students never possess: direct connection to music's emotional truth. I think you should compete." After agonizing for days, Isabella agreed to compete. They chose her program carefully. Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, the piece that had first captured Isabella's imagination and represented her musical awakening, followed by her own improvisation that Professor Vasquez had helped her structure into a coherent composition they titled Finding Voice, a piece that told the story of her journey from silence to song. The next month was the most intense and transformative period of Isabella's life. She practiced the Nocturne until she could play it flawlessly even when she was dead tired, until every phrase felt like a natural extension of her breath, until the piece became so much a part of her that she could feel Chopin's emotions flowing through her fingers as if they were her own. The improvisation was more challenging to perfect because it came from such a deeply personal place. Working with Professor Vasquez, Isabella learned how to shape the emotional arc of the piece, while still maintaining the spontaneous feeling that made it so powerful. They worked on building tension and release, on how to use silence as effectively as sound, on how to make every note count in telling her story. Don't try to impress them with technical fireworks. Professor Vasquez advised during one of their final preparation sessions, her voice gentle but firm. Let them hear your truth. That's what makes you special. You're not trying to be anyone else when you play. You're sharing your authentic self, and that's rarer and more valuable than any technical skill. Competition day arrived cold and gray, with frost covering the windows of Isabella's apartment like crystalline warnings. She had requested the entire day off from her diner job, losing wages she couldn't afford, but knowing this opportunity might never come again. Mrs. Chan, their elderly neighbor who had always been kind to the children, agreed to watch Sophia and Diego, and Isabella promised them they could come to hear her play if they wanted to. The morning felt surreal. Isabella woke before her alarm, her stomach churning with nervous energy that made eating impossible. She made breakfast for her children with shaking hands, trying to project calm while her mind raced through her pieces. Sophia noticed her mother's nervousness immediately and climbed into her lap during breakfast, wrapping her small arms around Isabella's neck with fierce love. "Mama, are you scared?" she asked, her 8-year-old wisdom cutting straight to the heart of things. "A little bit, baby," Isabella admitted, holding her daughter close. "But sometimes being scared means you're about to do something really important." The competition was scheduled for 2 p.m. in the main concert hall. Isabella arrived at 1 p.m., wearing the only dress she owned that seemed appropriate for such an occasion. A simple black dress she had bought secondhand for her cousin's wedding 3 years earlier. She had spent her last $20 getting it dry cleaned, and though it was simple and unadorned, it made her feel dignified and prepared for whatever was to come. The concert hall buzzed with nervous energy. Families clustered around their competitors, offering last-minute encouragement and support. Isabella felt acutely alone until she spotted Professor Vasquez near the entrance, scanning the crowd. When their eyes met, Professor Vasquez's face broke into a warm smile, and she hurried over to Isabella's side. "How are you feeling?" Professor Vasquez asked, studying Isabella's face for signs of panic. "Terrified," Isabella admitted honestly, "but also excited." "Is that normal?" "Completely normal. The fact that you're nervous means you care deeply about this, and that caring is what will make your performance special." 8 competitors were scheduled to perform that afternoon, ranging in age from 16 to 35. Isabella was 7th on the program, which meant she would have to sit through 6 other performances while her nerves built to almost unbearable levels. As she listened to the other competitors, each one technically proficient and polished, she felt her confidence beginning to crumble. These people had been studying music their entire lives, had teachers who charged more for a single lesson than Isabella made in a week, had opportunities and advantages she could never hope to possess. When her name was called, Isabella felt like walking through water. She sat at the bench, adjusted it, and took a deep breath. Then she began to play. The Chopin filled the hall with crystalline clarity. Beyond technical accuracy was profound feeling that transformed the familiar piece into something personal and intimate. Her interpretation spoke of lonely nights working while children slept, soaring hopes for their future. When the nocturne ended, complete silence preceded scattered applause. Dean Richardson leaned forward, expression no longer bored but intensely focused. Without pausing, Isabella moved to her original composition. This was her story in music, the journey from desperation to hope, silence to song. Simple but profound melody building from quiet introspection to triumphant affirmation before peaceful resolution. Playing the final notes, tears streamed down Isabella's face. She had given everything, held nothing back. The silence stretched forever. When Isabella finally looked up, Dean Richardson was standing, his own eyes bright with tears. The entire audience rose in endless standing ovation. Through applause, she saw Professor Vasquez in the wings, tears streaming as she clapped with fierce pride. Dean Richardson approached the stage deliberately. "Ladies and gentlemen," his voice carried clearly, "in 30 years of judging competitions, I have never heard anything like what we just experienced." He addressed Isabella directly. "Ms. Martinez, you demonstrated something that cannot be taught in any conservatory. You showed us what it means to speak directly from the heart through music. It would be our honor to have you study here. The scholarship was hers. More than that, she'd been recognized for something she'd always carried but never had opportunity to share. Her children reached her first, Sophia launching into her arms. "Mama, that was beautiful." Everyone was crying. The months following her scholarship victory brought a whirlwind of change that sometimes left Isabella feeling dizzy with the speed of her transformation. The scholarship covered not only full tuition but also a modest living stipend that allowed her to quit her exhausting diner job. For the first time in years, she could focus on something other than mere survival, could think beyond the next rent payment or grocery bill. She kept her position at the conservatory, but now she cleaned during different hours, and her entire relationship with the building had transformed completely. Instead of being an outsider looking in through windows at a world she could never enter, she was part of the community, a student with her own practice room key and access to instruments whenever she needed them. The hallways she had once walked as an invisible worker now welcomed her as a belonging member of the musical family. Her course load was intensive but thrilling in ways she had never imagined possible. In addition to her private lessons with Professor Vasquez, she took classes in music theory, music history, and piano pedagogy. Every subject fascinated her, feeding a hunger for knowledge that had been dormant for most of her adult life. The theory classes helped her understand the mathematical relationships she had intuited in music, while the history courses gave emotional and cultural context to the pieces she was learning to play. In her music history class, she learned about the lives of the composers whose works she was studying. When she discovered that Chopin had written his nocturnes while homesick for Poland, living in exile in Paris, she felt a deep connection to his sense of displacement and longing that added new layers of meaning to her interpretations. Learning about Schumann's struggles with mental illness and his passionate love for Clara helped her understand why his music spoke so directly to her own experiences of emotional turbulence. The other students were initially curious about the scholarship winner who had appeared seemingly from nowhere, the single mother who had won the most prestigious award the conservatory offered. But Isabella's genuine humility, her obvious dedication, and the raw emotion she brought to her playing won most of them over quickly. There were a few who resented her rapid rise from janitor to student, whispering about special treatment and affirmative action. But they were in the minority, and their voices were quickly drowned out by the obvious quality of Isabella's musical development. Isabella's children adapted to their mother's new schedule and status with the resilience that children often show in the face of positive change. Sophia delighted in having a mother who was learning alongside her, often sitting quietly in the corner of Isabella's practice room, doing homework while her mother worked through scales and etudes. She would ask questions about the music, and Isabella found deep joy in sharing her growing knowledge with her daughter, explaining in simple terms how different keys could create different moods, how composers used melody and harmony to tell stories without words. Diego remained more reserved about the dramatic changes in their lives, his 10-year-old mind suspicious of anything that seemed too good to be true after so many years of struggle. But Isabella could see his pride in the way he told his friends that his mother was studying to become a professional musician, how he stood a little straighter when he walked past the conservatory on his way to school, knowing that his mother belonged in that beautiful building now. The real transformation was in Isabella herself. The bone-deep exhaustion that had been her constant companion for years began to fade, replaced by an energy that came from doing work that fed her soul rather than just paying bills. She moved through her days with a sense of purpose and direction that had been missing for most of her adult life. The lines of worry around her eyes softened, and she found herself humming while she worked, something she hadn't done since she was a teenager dreaming of a different life. Professor Vasquez watched Isabella's development with a mixture of professional pride and personal satisfaction that she had rarely experienced in her 15 years of teaching. She had worked with many talented students over the years, young people with natural gifts and expensive training, but she had never witnessed such a complete transformation of a human being. Isabella wasn't just learning to play the piano. She was discovering who she was meant to be, uncovering parts of herself that had been buried under years of survival and struggle. 6 months after competition, Isabella gave her first student recital Bach, Chopin, Debussy, plus another original composition. As she played, She thought about that first night touching piano keys, driven by unnamed longing. She remembered the fear hearing, "Don't touch the piano." Now, fingers moving with growing confidence. She understood the piano had never been forbidden territory. It had been waiting for her to find courage to claim what was always hers. The janitor told not to touch the piano was gone, replaced by a woman who'd found her voice. Dean Richardson had stood in tears not just for the music, but for the story it told. The journey from silence to song embodying music's transformative power. Isabella's story was far from over. Years of study lay ahead, countless practice hours, challenging performances. But she'd accomplished the most important thing, finding the language waiting inside her all along, learning to speak it with authentic voice that comes only from life fully lived and honestly expressed. Every night, tucking her children into bed, Isabella would share her conservatory day. But the most important lesson wasn't about music. It was about courage to reach for impossible dreams, persistence despite odds, and faith that sometimes risking everything for what you love means the universe reaches back to lift you up in unimaginable ways.